But yeah, so we were talking about getting your hive up to strength. Kind of the big thing there is making sure you have a healthy queen and you have sufficient brood. And I think the real takeaway from that was, if you're concerned about the strength of your hive, give it a bunch of food. Give it all sorts of syrup or honey. That's a good way to stimulate growth. The general takeaway I got from the fall and winter maintenance was feed your bees all the time, and that's what Bebop said he does, with pollen. Yes. But the other thing you need to watch out for is mites and disease. So one of the biggest killers of bees when they're in the overwintering period is going to be 3 basic diseases. You've got varroa mites, you've got tracheal mites, and you've got nosema. Those are really the 3 you need to watch out for. But we'll go into the details of how you check for these various pests when we get into the IPM section. But at this point, it's basically good enough to know that you should be checking for pests right before they go into overwintering, because that is a time where the bees are basically stuck in the hive and are super vulnerable. Another major discussion I saw going on was this idea of insulation. So lots of beekeepers in the north, basically worry that their bees are going to get too cold during the winter time. And when the bees get cold, they're going to have to work harder to heat up their hive, they're going to use more of their honey, and they're ultimately going to die. It's a big concern. And so what some of them do is they put insulation on the hive, right? I saw lots of pictures of people had these board, plywood sheets that were painted black that they would tie around the outside of a hive. Some people would pile up snow around them. Do all these things to basically try and keep the heat inside the hive. The research, however, on this basically says there doesn't seem to be any benefit to insulating your hives. Painting them black, putting the insulation on, all this stuff, doesn't seem to increase survival. In some cases, it really backfires on you. 2 reasons. One is, if you're insulating your hive, you're not just keeping the heat in, but you're also keeping the cold in. So if it's really cold at night and the inside of your hive gets cold, and then the sun comes out and starts shining on it, it's going to take longer for the sun to heat up the inside of the hive as well. So you're basically just sort of drawing out the process of heating and cooling. The other issue is that if you're in a place, if your bees are warmer, they're actually going to be more active. They're going to be more likely to leave the hive, to go roaming, to walk around the hive and forage for honey and pollen resources that are in the hive. So, providing all this extra heat can actually make them go through their resources more quickly. That's kind of the issue we have here in the Central Valley, is if you have a warm winter, the bees are going to be leaving the hive a lot, or they're going to be going through the reserves pretty quickly. So in some cases, keeping your bees somewhere like the Central Valley, where it's sort of warm, but not really warm enough to have lots of good forage, can actually be worse for your bees than sending them there somewhere where it's actually pretty cold, and they're going to go into a real solid overwintering state. But the general recommendation is you don't have to worry about insulation. What you really just need to do is keep your bees protected from the winds. That's the main concern. If you have your entrance facing the direction of the prevailing winds, it can go right up in the hive and chill it very quickly. And also you need to provide some sort of extra ventilation for the bees during this period to help them get the air out of the hive. Reason for this is the bees are basically in that hive in a tight little ball down at the bottom, and they're trying to keep warm. So they form a little ball, they're buzzing their wings, they're metabolizing a lot of honey, they're producing a lot of moisture when they breathe out. And that moisture is going to accumulate in the hive, and it's possible for it to collect on the top board and start dripping down on the bees. And so you end up with this wet hive that's perfect for fungal pathogens, bacteria, all sorts of nasty stuff. So if you provide either an absorbent layer on the top or an extra hole in the top for that wet air to come out of, that'll really help out in avoiding those diseases.
What would be an absorbent layer?
Some people are using straw, dried grasses. You can put an extra super on top and put
Pack it up.
exactly, pack it up with something that's absorbent to moisture, and that seems to do the trick.
We wouldn't really need something like that here, though, would we?
You wouldn't actually need that. You would want to provide some extra ventilation though. So some keepers, what they do is they'll have like a little extra hole drilled in the top sucker or the top hive body, just something for the air to come out of as well. All right, so what's going on during the winter time? Basically, in the overwintering period, when it gets cold, when it's, say, less than about 50 degrees or so, what the bees are doing is they're basically forming a tight cluster around the brood. The bee brood, right, is basically the next generation that's going to come out in the spring and help them forage to build up their existing population. So the bees put a lot of effort into protecting the brood and making sure that they have a good brood stock when the spring rolls around. The trick with brood, right, is that their ideal temperature to grow at and develop at is around 90 degrees. So it's a little bit tricky for bees to maintain a 90-degree brood in the middle of winter when it may be like in the 5, to -20-degree range outside. So what they basically do is form this shell where on the outside you have a layer of bees that are basically an insulation level. They're there to block out the cold, and they sit there and they vibrate their wing muscles. Bees have the ability to vibrate their wing muscles without moving their wings. So they can vibrate their muscles and use the heat generated from that vibration to basically heat the inside of the circle. Sort of like we talked about in economic entomology, where the honeybees can encapsulate those giant Asian hornets and basically cook them to death in that ball. They're basically doing that, but using it to heat up the hive. So they have this outer shell that's very tightly packed, that's vibrating, and as you move into the middle where the queen is, there's a queen and a bunch of nurse bees, and they basically have a fair bit of extra room to work in here. The center's not nearly as tightly packed, and they're in there tending to brood. And what the bees generally do is they're in this little circle. The outer bees will sometimes go out and forage for honey and pollen that's stored in the area around this circle. And the bees slowly rotate into the circle and then back out. So that when the bees on the outside are getting too cold and they're getting close to death, they'll rotate in, warm up, rotate back out. So it's sort of this slow cycle of constantly moving in and out. Right? As they consume the honey around them, this circle slowly just moves upwards, upwards, upwards. And ultimately, by the end of the spring, what you expect, or by the end of the winter, by the beginning of spring, you expect that cluster to have moved from the bottom of the box up towards the top. And they should be right up near the top when you go in and check them in the spring. So this is just some examples of what the cluster would look like in a healthy hive. This is one where the brood section is sort of moved up between the two frame bodies. So they just popped it open and you can see it cut right in half. So you see there's a nice circle. It's not quite in the middle of the box, but it's close. And it seems to be moving up into the second box. And something that's kind of cool is you can observe these clusters with a heat camera because there's enough heat generated you can view it through the box. And here you can see the clusters right up here on the lower end of the upper box. It's moving its way upwards as well. All right. Yeah. So something to keep in mind is that winter bees are physiologically different from the worker bees during the forage season. So we talked about the idea that forage bees, right? During the spring, the summer, the fall, the bees basically are, the egg is laid. It takes about 3 weeks for them to reach adulthood. Once they're adults, they have that really specific cycle of the jobs they work through, right? First, they're kind of like tending, then they become nurse bees for a while, and then they transition into foraging when they're older. During the winter time, basically all of those developmental steps are thrown out the window. The bees are physiologically different from the bees in the spring, summer, and fall. The major difference is that these guys are basically just built for keeping the hive warm and keeping as much energy as they can. So they've got these really large fat reserves. They've got enlarged hypopharyngeal glands for tending the young. And they don't do a whole lot of activity beyond clustering. They're basically just there to burn fat and to make heat. Yeah. And, during this process, it's not uncommon for a lot of bees to die because they are just sort of in there using the resource. They're packed tightly. It can be very cold. And so it is absolutely essential that when you put them in there that you have healthy brood to replace the bees that do die. And that's why we're really focused on making sure there's a large enough population at the beginning of the winter and that there's not a whole bunch of disease or parasites in the hive at that time. Because it's really common for bees to die out in the winter. There we go.
So if you don't have a large population, brood population, what would you do? Just buy new nukes?
So ideally, right, in the fall time, you're thinking about your overwintering by about the end of August, beginning of September, right? So you're opening up your boxes, you're taking a look at them, and you're estimating population size. The general recommendation is you want about 30,000 bees or so, and that's enough bees that if you were to go to the brood chamber and pull it out, you'd have 5 or 6 brood frames that are pretty solidly covered in worker bees. That's about what you're looking for. So let's say you go in your hive and you open it up, and you're not there. You have like maybe 2 or 3 frames. It's pretty weak. In September, what you can start doing is aggressively feeding them sugar syrup. That's going to stimulate the queen to start laying eggs. And so if she's going to start laying more eggs, it's going to stimulate the bees to repackage the honey around the brood ball. And so that should help them expand. Let's say you come back in like October, November, and you check on the bees to see did they grow much larger. And ideally they did, and you've got your 30,000. But let's say you come back and they're not doing so great. You've got this hive, and they look pretty much the same. At that point, what you're probably going to need to do is redistribute those bees amongst other hives. So what you can do is you can take the brood that's in the hive, brush the bees off it, and pop that in another weak hive, and then sort of artificially increase the strength of one of your hives, so that instead of losing 2 weak hives, you have 1 strong hive that's going to make it through the winter. I saw a bunch of resources that basically say if you've got a weak hive that you don't think is going to make it, just give it up for a loss, right? Harvest the honey, collect the pollen, collect the brood, right? Redistribute the brood as you can, and store the honey in the freezer, and then just let the bees die, because they're not going to make it anyway, and you don't want to lose that extra hive box, all that stuff, and invest time and energy into trying to get them through the winter. So sometimes being a bee manager is making harsh decisions and killing your bees. Which is a little harder than I suppose it is when you're, say, like choosing to tear like vines out of a vineyard or something, because bees are a little cuter. At least in my mind. Okay, so colonies die when they overwinter. This is the most common time when bees die. Some people have rough winters and they lose a lot of bees. Some people do well. Last year appears to have been a really rough winter. A lot of the people I talked to lost anywhere between 40 and 60% of their hives last winter. When we were at the Bee Symposium, they had a researcher from UC Davis who was saying that they have a new data set coming out that they have just begun to analyze, but it looks like there's a 3-year cycle of bee deaths, where it's kind of like you'll have a low year, the next year will be a little higher, then you'll have a big year of bee deaths, and then it'll be low again. And it seems to cycle. And it's that's kind of representative of maybe a parasite or a pathogen issue, right? That you start out with low pathogen load, it slowly builds up, then you get a critical year where there's so much pathogen in the system the bees can't withstand it, they all die, and that ends up purging a lot of the pathogen out of the population, so the next year the bees that are left do pretty well because there's a lot less pathogen load. That would be in line with what we see in terms of varroa pressure, nosema pressure, tracheal mite pressure, that they behave like pathogens. So that's not too surprising, but it's an interesting little data point. And we are in the year that was predicted to be a high death year. So yeah, tough on beekeepers. Not everybody had those losses, but a lot of people did. Did I answer your question? Yeah, okay. So why do bees die? One of the most common reasons bees die is that they just run out of honey. If you don't provision the bees with enough honey, they're just going to starve to death. Generally, a sign of a starved out hive is you pull the top off and there's no honey in there, right? So that's one. And 2, you'll have a queen, and maybe she'll have a small cluster, but there won't be any brood. There won't be very many workers. It's just a really sad situation. And a starved out hive is usually a dead hive. You're not going to be able to rehabilitate that queen very easily. Another issue you run into is that you don't have enough bees to maintain a cluster. And obviously, if your cluster is small, you're not going to be able to heat up that brood to that 90 degrees that they need. And so the brood will die off, they'll get chilled, and the bees won't be able to repopulate. And again, you'll have that small cluster with the queen or a totally dead hive. Oftentimes when this happens, though, you'll have a ton of honey in there, right? Because the bees just didn't manage to work their way through it. Digestive tracts compacted with too much waste, so the bees are full of shit, is basically what this means. Bees do not poop inside the hive, right? They are very clean. Bees need to leave the hive in order to poop. Bees will regularly undergo what's called cleansing flights. So if you keep bees, you'll notice this in the springtime or the winter time. If you have a bunch of days in a row that are really cold, right? Like below 50 degrees, cold enough that the bees don't want to fly, and then you'll get one of those weird midwinter days where it's in the upper 50s, lower 60s. A bunch of bees will all leave the hive, and they'll buzz around for a while, then they'll go back. They're basically taking a bathroom break. They're called cleansing flights. The bees leave the hive, they poop, they go back in the hive. And that's basically what they're doing. If the bees, for some reason, are totally stuck in the hive, they can't leave, then the waste will just compact, and it'll actually become toxic and they'll die. This is a bigger issue in the north, where sometimes what happens is you get a ton of snow, the snow covers the entrance, and the bees just physically can't get out for like weeks or months on end. So it's recommended in the north, what you might want to do is create a second entrance near the top of the hive, so the bees can always get out through that entrance. But down here, not such a big issue. Bees are able to leave and poop as they need. And lastly, the bees may exhibit PMS, which in bees means something very different. It's parasitic mite syndrome. So that would be death from tracheal or varroa mite populations, or CCD, which is colony collapse disorder, which is not well understood. But briefly, colony collapse disorder is when you go out to your hive, you open it up, and a hive that was otherwise healthy, like you may have gone out there a week or two ago and there were plenty of bees buzzing around in it, you open up the top and all the bees are gone. The honey's there, there's maybe a couple dead bees, there's usually the queen and a handful of tenders, but everybody else is gone. And it's not clear why CCD happens, but it's been happening with more regularity.
They've never gotten like a video of it, or like a video of all the bees leaving and possibly like looking at where they went?
It's possible they have, but I haven't seen it.
So when they leave, they would just look for another suitable location to live.
Don't know. It's a great mystery. It is mysterious. I don't know if it's some sort of swarming behavior without the queen, or if they're flying off and dying. There's some speculation that's what's happening is the bees are basically going out and foraging, and they're just so weak that they can't come back to the hive. But it's not clear why they're foraging, since most of this happens in the winter time. So, not quite sure what's going on.
Next research.
There's so much research into CCD. But yeah, it might be an interesting to look at, because it does happen in warmer climates too, so yeah. All right, so general catch-alls of winter management. So a lot of this was fall management. In the winter, what are you supposed to do? Basically try and stay out of the colonies as much as possible. Bees are super temperature sensitive, right? During the winter, they're spending a lot of energy keeping the hive warm. So if you're going out there and cracking it open all the time and looking inside, you're basically leaching their heat out and making it harder for them to keep a nice warm hive. During this period, right, we mentioned that you can feed them sugar, but don't feed them sugar water. That can cause water balance issues. It can cause the sugar to drip on them. So you give them those solid sugar cakes we talked about last time, where it's basically sugar, corn syrup, and water cooked until it's a solid cake. And make sure your bees are somewhere where when they come out in the spring, they're going to have pretty immediate access to pollen and nectar In the spring, the bees are ramping that population back up, so they need as much forage as they can get. So it's oftentimes a good idea to choose an overwintering spot that has access to immediate resources as soon as the spring rolls around. So round about here, right, that would be like the stone fruits for the most part, and that's why we have so much activity in the almonds.
Can you move beehives pretty easily in the winter since they don't?
I think it is easier to move the bees, yeah, in the winter than it is in the summer when they're all active. But yeah, bees don't really like to come out when, you know, it's windy out. So driving them around on a truck is sort of a nice artificial wind type situation. But yeah, so the real key here, so the takeaway from all of this is that good fall maintenance really is the key to success in the winter time. If you want your hives to do well in the winter, you're going to have to dedicate some serious attention to them in the fall just to make sure they have adequate resources. Right? So making sure your colonies have enough honey, properly placed for clustering behavior. So ideally, we're trying to encourage the bees to set up shop in the middle of the bottom box in a nice tight cluster, and then providing them with honey on top so that when they move up, they'll move into that honey. Basically making sure your top box is full of capped honey and there is pollen around the brood. Those are the things we're looking for. And then making sure that your pests are either removed or mitigated as much as possible. So again, just doing a standard sort of check, right? Opening up your hives, pulling them out, saying, do I have lots of honey? Do I have lots of brood? Do I have enough workers? And do I have any pests in here? And if you can check all those boxes, or at least take the steps you need to, like if you have mites, if you can put your mite strips in, right? Yeah, those are all things to do in early fall, so that in the late fall when you do your final checks before the winter, you can basically say, everything looks fine. Yeah. All right. So that's the winter. Wintertime is really the most dangerous time for the bee colonies. It's when you expect to have losses. Prior to Varroa mites, losses were pretty typically in like the 10 to 15% range. You'd expect to lose about 1 in 10 hives, 1 in 8 or so. Now with Varroa mites, hive losses tend to be a little higher. You expect it to be closer to anywhere between 15 and like 40% or something like that. It's not unusual to lose 30% of your hives every year. So they're just getting harder to maintain. There's a lot of pressure on bees. But spring is really the busiest season for the beekeeper.
This one's not on platform.
Oh, no, it's not. I will post it, though, and it'll be posted complete. But yeah. So spring, March through May, if you're here in the Central Valley, it's a little bit more like February through April. It's going to be the really busy season for the beekeeper. This is when you are actively managing your hives to make sure they don't swarm, so you don't end up losing a ton of your bees, and so that they can grow big and strong so you can get a good honey harvest. So they break this up in the book into early, late, and mid, and late spring. Early spring really is just a season where you go out and you check your hives and you see how did they do over the winter, right? You start opening up the hives, you see, okay, how does my equipment look? Did I suffer a lot of losses? How healthy are my hives? If you have a bunch of losses, this is the time where you start cleaning up. You collect your frames, put them into storage, put your boxes out somewhere where they can air out or get cleaned. And basically you're just cleaning up from whatever you lost. Towards the middle of the spring, this is where you are actively working to keep your colonies intact, and you're watching for queen cells. So basically, you're just trying to avoid swarms as much as possible, right? Mid-spring is when we expect most of the forage to come available. These hives are going to be growing like crazy, and it's very possible they're going to try and look for areas to expand to. And then in the late spring, you're getting them ready for the honey season. So summer, early fall is when you expect to get most of your actual honey that's harvestable. So this is when you're starting to super the colonies and basically getting them to the locations where you expect the nectar to be. So we'll kind of jump through these. Yeah. So we talked about this. I talked about this briefly, but right, early spring really is the time to do your inspections. So when it's still a little bit cold, maybe it's a little too early for the bees to forage, it's a good time to get out there and start looking for your winter kills. This is especially important if you are a pollinator service provider, right? Because you've promised people a certain number of hives at a certain amount of strength, and so you need to go out there and figure out how many hives do you actually have and what is their strength, so that you can make those contracts, make updates, and make sure that you can provide everybody with the bees you said you were going to give them. And something that's just important here is that oftentimes when you open these hives, the brood's going to be right up there in that top box in a nice tight ball, and you don't want to disrupt them at this point. You just want to leave them be. It's still a little chilly outside, and chilling your brood is a really quick way to kill them, so just leave the brood alone during these inspections as much as possible. Here we go. So I mentioned earlier cleansing flights, where basically the bees will come out when it's about 60 degrees Celsius or so, or 60 degrees Celsius, let's hope not. That's really hot. 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Let me edit that. There we go. They'll come out and do their cleansing flights. I mentioned this earlier, right? That's just when they fly out to poop. But here you can see a nice snowy field where you can see where all the bees have made their droppings. But as soon as the weather starts to get warm, you're going to want to start thinking about stimulating them to producing more brood. So one issue you might find is you open up a hive and they've made it through the winter, but they're not in good shape. Maybe you had 30,000 bees at the beginning of the winter, and now you have like 10,000 or something, or 5,000. Enough bees for the hive colony to survive, but not really a lot. Not a good number of bees for pollinating, for building up. So what can you do to stimulate these weak colonies? Well, there's a couple of things you can do. The first thing is you can feed those colonies with dilute sugar syrup. Giving bees sugar syrup is just a general good way to get them to lay eggs and to compact their brood no matter what. Another thing that you should really consider is reversing the hive bodies. So like I mentioned before, if this is a cross-section of our hive, the tendency of the cluster is to start in the bottom at the winter and to move up into the top box. When they're up here in this top box, they basically have expanded as far as they can go, and it's not natural for bees to expand downward. So you can help them out by basically taking the top box, putting it on the bottom board, then taking the bottom box and putting it on top, right? So basically just swapping your boxes. This puts the bees in the natural position that they prefer, with the brood down towards the bottom, and it also gives them a nice upper box that they will just naturally fill with honey and pollen and use as an expansion area as the brood grows larger. So reversing the hives is a really common practice early in the season. Another thing you need to look out for in spring is what's called honey-bound hives. And this was new to me. I hadn't heard of this. But the idea is that some colonies, what they'll do is they'll come through the winter and they will have not eaten up all of their honey resources. So that basically, if this is your two boxes, ignore this empty box on the top. Let's say these are your two boxes, and over the winter, they moved up into the top box, but they didn't consume all the honey, so they've got capped honey all up around them. And they started foraging, and they started filling in the area around the bottom of the brood with honey as well. This creates a situation where basically there's so much honey in the hive, so much pollen stored, that the queen has run out of cells to lay her eggs in. She can't physically expand the brood any larger because there's no room to put the brood. They're stuck. So this is basically a too much of a good thing problem. They have too much forage and they're stuck. At this point, it's the beekeeper's responsibility to free up the honey-bound hive so that they can start expanding upwards or move this back down. Now there's two approaches here. One approach, this will be easier to show on a drawing board. So let's say these are your hive boxes. And let's say you're in a situation where your brood is all down here still, but they are completely blocked in with frames of honey on the top. Right? They've got honey and pollen all around them. They're basically just stuck there. The colony can't grow. So in a situation like this, where your top box doesn't have any brood in it, the solution is relatively simple. Basically, you take out the middle 2 or 3 frames that are full of honey, and you would replace those with empty frames that don't have anything in it. This will allow the brood to just sort of naturally expand into that area. You can provide a super on top of this where they'll start storing the new honey, and the brood will just sort of fill into here, and they'll start using this neighboring honey to feed that brood. And that'll open the whole thing up.
Well, what would happen in a natural setting? Like, say there was no more space for these things, like we weren't there to mitigate or anything.
What'll happen is the hive will survive. It's just going to stay small because they'll only have this much room for the brood. So, if you have a hive of 30,000, it's probably going to stay right around that 30,000 point. Maybe what you'll do is you'll get into a situation where the population will decrease until they get small enough that they can start growing the brood again, and then they'll clear this out over time. But as a beekeeper, we don't want a situation where our brood actually decreases. We want to keep them growing for the honey season. So it seems like bees have ways to get out of this naturally, but if you're in the production side of things, you want to help them along. An alternative fix is if the brood is in between the 2 boxes, you can do a box reversal, just like we talked about on the last slide, where you flip the top and the bottom boxes. This separates the brood so that you have some brood in the top, at the very top of the top box, some brood at the very bottom of the bottom box. And the bees don't like this. So what will happen is the bees will put a lot of effort into basically taking all this honey and moving it down here, and also clearing out area around this brood to sort of expand. So actually I said that the wrong way. Let me rephrase that. So ignore what I just said. When you do this reversal, bees don't like having this brood up here, so they'll put a lot of effort into moving the capped honey up here into the empty brood chamber as it starts to hatch and the adults start to emerge. And that'll clear up this bottom space for more brood as well. So basically, the natural tendency is bees will move this capped honey up to fill in this space, and this will be expanded as you free it up.
Will the queen start laying brood in the empty spaces in that middle box? Can you switch them like that?
No, typically the queen will go down, and you can help the queen along. So let's say you do this approach. Something you can do is make sure you find the queen and that she's in that bottom box, and you can put a queen excluder right here to make sure that the queen doesn't go up there and do that again. The general tendency is the queen's going to stay low as much as she can, but let's say it's not a nice 50-50 split like this. Let's say there's only a little bit of the brood in the top box, then she might go up to where most of the brood is. So that's a situation where a queen excluder might be really handy to sort of just keep her out of there. Yeah, and then similarly, later in the season, some beekeepers will just reverse hives like this even if they're not honey bound. Let's say you have a hive that's doing fine, it's not honey bound, but the brood is divided like this. Sometimes just a standard reversal like this will actually stimulate them to produce more brood and to grow the hive faster. And so it's just considered good practice to do a reversal anyway, just to get them to grow quickly.
What are the negatives of reversal?
The real negative of a reversal is going to be if you do it during cold weather, right? You're going to separate that brood, and it's going to be impossible for the bees to ball around it. So that's why they kind of talk about, in the book, they talk about how if you're in the early season, like early spring, like February or something, you should only do a reversal if the brood is almost entirely in that top box so that you can guarantee the brood will stay cohesive when you flip them. But in the later spring, when it's warmer out, it's okay to do this split because the bees don't need to work near as hard to keep that warm. And there's actually a whole variety of approaches we're going to touch on today where you can separate the queen from brood, move the brood between different chambers in order to stimulate them to produce more brood or to reduce the chances of swarming and basically manage your bees so that you have nice large populations. But yeah, the main concern is temperature control. Otherwise, they seem to do okay when it's separated. Because, I mean, honestly, right, I'm saying separated, but the reality is there's a difference of having all your brood right here versus having some up here and some down here. So it's not an insurmountable sort of distance. So again, feel free to stop me. Some of this stuff is going to get a little complicated. This one's not, though. This is called enlarging the brood or expanding the brood. This is an approach where if you feel like you have a hive and they're putting a lot of effort into foraging, but they're not growing their brood very much, what you can do is basically take your brood chamber and take the edges and expand them out 1 or 2 frames, and then insert empty frames in between the broods. Right? Does that make sense? Yeah. And basically, you're just creating an empty gap in the middle of your brood. The bees will naturally want to fill that, and so they'll fill that area in first, and you'll end up with a larger brood ball. So, you know, sort of just a larger brood in general. So that's early spring. Early spring really is just about taking your winter hives and making sure they're getting up to full strength as quickly as you can. Once you head into mid-spring, basically we're dealing with the consequences of that, right? We wanted to have these big, strong hives, but what do big, strong hives do? They swarm, exactly. So in the mid-spring, we're really concerned about making sure that our beautiful, big, healthy hives aren't going to fly off and become somebody else's hives, like my hives, you know, or Jesus's hives. Because we're basically bee burglars right now, but most beekeepers accept that when a hive swarms there, those are lost bees. They're not going to find them again. But anyway, ideally, right, when you're coming into mid-spring and you're doing your inspections around, say, like March or so, what you're expecting to see is that you should have brood filling both boxes. So you should have your 2 hive bodies, you should have brood split between them. You should have enough adults to cover all the brood cells. So you want those 2 boxes to be pretty close to full with adults buzzing around. You want to have at least 2 to 3 full frames of honey in there. They might not look like actual full frames. They might be 2 frames of honey split across a bunch of frames because it's in the corners and stuff. You want to make sure you have a good amount of pollen, active bee flight going on, and no disease. Those are the big things you're looking for at the end of spring. Right, and as I mentioned before, the big issue in the mid-spring to late spring is going to be swarms and managing your hive so you don't end up with a ton of swarms. So what we know is that swarming is primarily caused by 3 big factors. There's the number of adults and brood in the population relative to hive space. So basically, how crowded do the bees feel? Do the bees feel like they have lots of room to expand into their hive, or do they feel like they're all jammed together tight? If the bees feel crowded, they're more likely to swarm. The amount of available queen substance, we talked about this before, right? The queen produces the queen substance in her mandibles and her tergites, and it gets spread around to the hive, and the bees basically share it, and when the queen substance titer is low, that encourages the bees to swarm or to supersede. And then finally, there's environmental influences. Bees have a tendency to swarm in the springtime. Bees keep really close track of temperature and day length. And so when things start getting warm and the days start getting long, bees just naturally are more likely to swarm. Now, fortunately for us as beekeepers, I'll get to that later, we have the ability to control 2 of these things. There's not much we can do about day length and temperature, but we can very easily control the amount of adult or brood population in a hive, and we can take care of the amount of queen substance as well. So management really focuses on manipulating these two variables in the hive. So the main thing that you're doing at this time of year is you're doing your regular checks, you're taking care of your hives as normal, but what you're really looking for is evidence of queen cells, right? So it's perfectly normal for bees to make queen cups all the time, right? It's typical to open up a hive, pull out a frame, and see a little cup at the bottom, of the frames, or maybe up at the top. And, typically they'll just be empty. There's nothing in them. But if you open those up and you notice that they're starting to get elongated, or if you find a larva or an egg in them, that's a sign that the hive is actively moving towards a swarm or a supersedure. And that means that basically they've already started the ball rolling, and you need to perform some sort of maintenance to limit their ability to swarm. So, there's two major things you can do with swarms. There's swarm prevention, and there's what I would call swarm control. And I think of it almost like, in IPM, right, it's almost like cultural approaches versus, say, chemical or biological, right? Cultural approaches are highly preventative. They're things you should be doing all the time in order to reduce your pest populations. Swarm prevention is good practices you should be doing in the hive to prevent a swarm from happening in the first place. So in general, crowding is a major factor that causes swarming. So you kind of want to keep an eye on your hives and see, are they getting crowded? When I open up the top of the box, is it full up with honey to the top and I've got bees kind of overflowing the thing? That's pretty darn crowded. I might want to think about adding some supers to that to give them a little bit of space to expand into, to free them up a bit. So you might want to consider, say, adding another hive body to a very strong hive that appears like it's about to grow over.
If you have your brood pretty far spread out between two hive bodies, could you throw a box in the middle? Would they fill that in, or is that too big?
That's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head. I know that there are all sorts of methods for supering where people get creative like that, where you'll do like bottom supers, where you can, like let's say you have a super of honey, you can, and you're afraid the bees aren't going to keep moving upwards, you can take that super off, put an empty super on where it was, and then put the full super on top, so you create a gap between the honey and the brood, and they'll naturally fill that in very quickly. But I'm not sure. Do you know, Bebop? Do you know if you can sort of separate the brood and put like an empty box in there?
Yeah, do it.
Do it? Do it.
Okay.
Doesn't stress them out or anything. Well, I mean, I guess you're kind of trying to stress them out a little.
A whole new frame of mind. You could expand the brood nest right there.
Mm-hmm.
You
Okay.
have to put some brood in there.
Well, there
You got brood on both sides of it.
makes sense. All right.
Check your combs.
Mm-hmm.
See if they're phone combs or worker.
I guess that's true. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I guess take a look at your combs. Make sure you're putting
Or wax moths.
nice high quality comb in there when you do that. You wouldn't want to put a bunch of empty foundation because then they're going to spend a lot of time building. Drawing it out and not putting their brood in there. It'll probably slow the whole thing down. But if you have some nice drawn comb that's ready to go and is pest free and all that, then it should be okay. All right. Yeah, providing sufficient nectar storage space. This gets at the same idea of creating space, that you don't want to create a situation where your brood is so full that there's not really sufficient space for honey in the hive, so the bees might feel like we're too big for the amount of resources we have. We should swarm and reduce our population a little bit. So this is a good practice in actively supering, making sure that you have empty space for them to move into. It's been recommended that you should also orient the bees so they get good sunlight early in the season, preferably with the entrances facing the direction the sun will be coming up in. I'm honestly not entirely sure why they recommended this. I'm sure it's good for the bees to see the sun. I've seen this recommended a lot. I haven't seen a lot of research to back up why this is. Do you know why?
I don't go south in summer.
No.
Too
Yeah.
hot on the porch.
Right, too hot.
But, yeah, early, like during the almonds, east or
Mm-hmm.
south.
Okay, and that's just good for getting heat into the hive. Is that the idea?
Earlier flight,
Oh, earlier flights. That makes sense.
warm it up.
There we go. I'm going to pop that in so I remember that for next year. Yeah, misspelled sufficient and ventilation. Sufficient ventilation. Yeah, basically, you just want to reduce stress as much as possible. So if you've got a winter entrance reducer in there, you want to make sure that gets out early in the season so that the bees have more airflow. And then you also want to make sure you're putting a young queen in most colonies. Old queens are the ones that are more likely to swarm, right? Because they're the ones that are going to have that reduction in queen substance. Young queens are going to be stronger, more vigorous. And so having young queens in your hives is going to reduce your total amount of swarms. So, so consequently, what a lot of beekeepers are doing now is a lot of them are purchasing queens. They're ordering their queens in advance so that in the springtime, they can basically open up their hives and they can just start replacing old queens with new queens at the beginning of the season.
I remember Tom, what's his name? That he presented to us.
Mike.
Yeah, Mike talked about that.
Mhm.
Yeah, I remember him saying bring in, receiving some queens right around April time.
Exactly. And so a lot of them are looking at just, they know which boxes have the old queens, they know which queens have been around for a while. Or you have situations where you come out of the winter and you just have some queenless hives. Maybe you have some hives that, the workers have survived, but the queen has died, and you just need to put a new queen in there. So that's sort of another standard maintenance. But yeah, young queens are going to reduce your chances of swarms. But let's say you have a situation where you go out, you're inspecting your hives, and you find queen cells that have eggs or larvae in them, right? You have evidence that the hive is preparing to swarm. So prevention is off the table. What do I actually do to take care of this? In general, what you need to do are two things. One is you need to get rid of all those queen cells, right? Because then once those queen cells are ready to hatch, that's when the swarm is going to occur. And you oftentimes need to manipulate the brood in order to reduce the hive population in some way, or to trick the bees into thinking that you have reduced the hive population. So there's a variety of ways you can get about this. So sort of the first thing you can do is queen removal. In this case, what you basically do is you go into the hive, you find all those queen cells, you scrape them off, get rid of them, so there's no queen cells in there. Then you go into the brood box, you find the queen, and you just remove her from the hive for 7 to 10 days. Maybe you pop her in a separate box for a little while with some attendants, or you get a cage or something. Just basically separate her so she's not in the hive. The bees will pretty quickly pick up on the fact that there is no queen, and they'll sort of start getting ready to, basically it's almost like an artificial swarm situation, right? Or an artificial supersedure. They think that the event has happened, and then 7 to 10 days later, you put a queen in the box. You can do any number of things. You can either put the old queen back in, you can get a new queen and put her in the box, you can introduce a capped queen cell, or you could just leave a single queen cell in the hive from the beginning and let that hatch and become the new queen of the hive. So basically, again, just an artificial swarm event where you don't actually change the population any, but you do trick them into thinking that the queen was gone and now they have a new queen. The advantage here is that if the queen is gone for 7 to 10 days, you've broken the brood cycle. So you have about a week to 10 days without any young, so that you'll expect a period where there are no new bees being born for about a week, and this is going to reduce the hive population. So functionally, it is sort of creating a swarm event where you're reducing the population by a certain percentage.
Could you, might be a stupid question, could you remove, if your hive has indication of a potential swarming, could you remove some frames and transfer them into like a weaker hive?
Yes, and that's one of the things we're going to talk about here in a minute. But no, yeah, that's a super valid approach. And that's something that a lot of beekeepers do just to naturally expand hives or to bolster weak hives. So this is just some of the, I just thought, I don't think I've shown pictures of this before, or if I have, I don't remember. But if you do purchase a queen from a queen supplier, you'll end up with something like this oftentimes. It's just a little plastic cage with a queen in it. Basically, she's in there, and this is the entrance, and it's plugged with fondant. And the idea is, if you just threw a queen into the box, the workers would recognize her as foreign, and they'd try and get rid of her, oftentimes. So by keeping the queen in the cage for about 3 or 4 days, the workers will get used to her, get used to her smell, recognize her as the new queen, and they'll be more likely to accept her. The plug is long enough that it'll take about 3 or 4 days for the bees and the queen to eat through it, so that the queen will just sort of naturally release herself out into the hive after a certain number of days. Alternatively, what you can do is buy a queen cell that someone has reared. They have these special frames. I don't think I put one on there. There we go. So basically, this is it. It's a frame that you can put in where they have all these little artificial cups that queen cells can be built onto. And you can basically manipulate your hives in such a way that they will start producing queen cells in large numbers. And some people basically make their whole living in beekeeping off of producing these queen cells and then selling them to other beekeepers for queen replacements. Now, this is something I haven't honestly looked into in any great detail, so I can't give you any detail on how this works. But if we have some time to talk about queen breeding towards the end of the semester, I'm interested in learning about it. But this is kind of what the final product looks like. You can see the little cap where it was attached to the frame and the queen cell. And what you can do is, if you don't have any queen cells available, but you want to introduce a new queen, you can purchase one of these and just sort of stick it in your hive on some of the brood frames. And when this hatches, they'll be treated as a new virgin queen that'll have to go out and mate and establish a hive, or take care of the colony that it's in. Right. So this is what Matteo was talking about, is that you can also do brood removal, which is, again, functionally creating an artificial swarm, where what you do is, you go in, again, you remove those queen cells from the hive, you take 3 to 5 frames of brood along with the workers, and you take those and you put them in a second box, maybe a new hive body, maybe a new nuke box or something like that, and then you would provide those bees with a new queen. Again, you can purchase queens, you can buy those capped queens, or you could just leave some of the queen cells behind. So maybe you don't kill all the queen cells in the box, you just leave a few of them on there and you slide those right in with your brood frames, since they should be attached to the brood frames. As far as the number, I've seen people recommend either leaving multiple or leaving one. I think when you're dealing with a new group of brood like this, I don't think it matters how many you leave as far as the number of queens. They'll all fly out and mate, and then when they come back, they'll battle it out to see who gets to be the actual queen. All right. Another thing you can do, and this one's a little complicated, this is separating the foragers and the nurse bees, or the Desmarais method. This is named after some dude from Cincinnati a long time ago. But basically, This is just a really interesting sort of way of manipulating the boxes and separating the worker from the forager bees so that they think there's been a swarm. So the basic idea here is that in the hive you have two major groups of bees, right? The worker bees do a ton of different jobs, but for the most part, most of the workers are either going to be nurse bees or they're going to be forager bees. And nurse bees and forager bees have very different interests in what they want to do, right? Forager bees are going to be really interested in tending the stores, going out and gathering things. Nurse bees are going to be most interested in hanging out with the brood and taking care of them. So in this situation, what you're basically doing is you're creating a situation where you're going to separate the nurse bees down in the bottom box from the forager bees up in the top box, so that the nurse bees and the forager bees think that a swarm has happened because they're not bumping into each other anymore. So that you're just tricking the bees into thinking that the population is way lower than it actually is. So basically what you do is you take your boxes and you disassemble them, right? You lay them all out. You take your brood chamber and you look through there until you find the queen. Once you find the queen, you take her and you take 1 to 2 frames of sealed brood and you move her into an empty hive body that's full of empty comb with a queen excluder on top. So basically this is a new hive body. You put the queen in here, 1 to 2 frames of brood that's capped and sealed, right? And then you have a queen excluder. You take that, you put it on your bottom board. So that's your base. So the queen's stuck down there, right? Then you take 1 to 2 supers of drawn comb, preferably drawn empty comb, and you put those on top of that box. Boom, boom. So you're putting a little bit of separation in there. Then you take the hive body with the remaining brood, and you place that right on top of those supers. And basically what you've done here is you've separated out the bees. So your brood is up here right now, but as the days pass, these brood are going to hatch, they're going to emerge, they're going to become new nurse bees, but the queen's going to be down here laying her eggs and establishing new brood. Now, nurse bees are naturally most attracted to the capped brood. So as the bottom of the box starts to be filled with capped brood, the nurse bees are going to stop spending time up here and they're going to start moving down and hanging out in the queen's box. But all the foragers, they really like to put honey in old brood cells. So the foragers are going to hang out here, and as these cells empty out, they're going to put a lot of effort into putting the honey up here. So the foragers are going to spend more and more time in this top box. The nurses are going to spend more and more time in this bottom box, and they're going to feel a lot less crowded. They're going to feel like there's no real need to swarm. So the trick is that about every 7 to 10 days, you're going to have to come to this hive, open up the old brood box, and make sure there are no queen cells. You have to remove those queen cells every time you go in there so that they don't actually go through a swarm. And basically, if you go in every 7 to 10 days and you remove those queen cells, eventually the desire to swarm is going to pass, and they're going to stop putting in new queen cells. Basically, yeah, repeat until the swarm impulse is over, and then you can remove the queen excluder and kind of let them rebuild the hive as needed. So this was one where I found just a little video sort of showing how this works relatively shortly. Right? Right. So we've taken off our lid, our supers. Now we have our hive body with the brood and the queen inside. We take our empty box, we put it on the bottom. And now we're basically just going to go through that brood box and look for the queen. Once you find her, you slide her in. with the frame she's on. And then top it off. Hop on the supers. In this one, they do a second queen screw up here on the top. That's not essential, but they do it. You end up with these, fat stacks of these. So in my mind, that's kind of the equivalent of unplugging the computer and then plugging it back in. The standard reset model of bees. It's like, did you try taking the queen and try unplugging the queen and plugging her back in, and then letting the bees reset, and they kind of take to that reasonably well. And then there's shook swarming, or also known as artificial or shakedown swarming. And this is kind of what it sounds like. Basically, you have a hive that's about to swarm. You prep a new hive body, just like we did in the marquee method. So you have a hive body with a whole bunch of frames, typically with just empty combs or foundation. You don't want to provide them with anything, really. You remove 3 or 4 frames from the middle, and then you take your hive body, with your brood and your honey and everything. You just pull out the frames one by one and you just shake them out into that new box. Ideally, there we go. I got a little ahead of myself. Ideally, you should find the queen and put her in the new box before you start shaking. You don't want to kill your queen by accident. But you can place the queen in the new box, and then you basically just go through frame by frame and you shake your bees into that new box. And the idea here is you're not changing the total population size. You are getting rid of the brood from that box. So the bees basically are going into a new box. They feel like they've swarmed. They feel like they're missing all the brood because they are, but they still have the same queen, and they'll just establish a new hive there. Yeah. And then once all the frames are shaken, you can cover the box and store the old frames for whatever purposes you have. Again, you could redistribute those frames to some of your weaker hives. If you have honey or pollen, you can put it in a freezer for storage. You can do all manner of things. And this is oftentimes an approach that's not just used for swarm control, but is a reasonable way to deal with diseases that are based in the frames. So if you have things like American foul brood, European foul brood, things like that where you have a whole bunch of diseased larvae that you don't want in the hive anymore, you can sort of shake off the workers and then destroy the frames that have been infected. And, keep your bees and your queen without, keeping the infection. All right, then to wrap up. Just to wrap up, in general, in the late spring, when you're heading into the summer, sort of the honey season, which we'll talk about in the Tuesday lecture, it should be generally remembered that during this whole period, you're not just managing swarms, you're also doing all the standard management you would do with bees. You're potentially feeding them, monitoring for diseases, replacing frames that are broken, odds and ends like that. But in the late spring, the final job is really just getting ready for supering. Ideally, by late spring, you've managed your swarms, you've got a nice large population in your boxes, and it's time to start, thinking of prepping my bees for the actual nectar flow, for getting that honey. So that's adding your supers. Now, I've heard a lot of things about when you're supposed to be adding supers. One of the recommendations I saw was, when you have 5 to 6 frames of drawn comb in the top box. This is if you have a new hive. Once your top box has 5 to 6 frames of drawn comb, that's when you're starting to think about putting more boxes on top to give them room to expand into. Some beekeepers I've talked to have talked about the idea of when you're reliably finding bees at the top of the box, so the very topmost area of your frames, that's when you need to start thinking about supers and room for expansion. I don't know, Bob, do you have any rules of thumb for when it's time to expand your hives and put some supers on?
Find a good bloom.
Okay, so generally if you have the nectar resources.
Yeah, you gotta get to a